Selamat malam untuk pemirsa Belajar Teologi di Indonesia. Jumpa lagi kita di Belajar Teologi di episode ke-74 bersama saya Lefrandi. Kita akan berdiskusi tentang satu tema yang menarik, yaitu formasi spiritual. Kali ini saya kedatangan tamu-tamu istimewa. Yang pertama adalah Dr. Eric Kyle. Beliau yang akan menjadi pemateri kita dan akan membahas bukunya yang berjudul Spiritual Being and Becoming, Christian and Scientific Views of Human Nature for Spiritual Formation. Dr. Kyle adalah Associate Professor at Lutheran School of Theology, Chicago. Beliau fokus kepada 3 area, yaitu yang pertama Educational Ministry and Spiritual Formation, kemudian Social Justice and Community Engagement Education, dan ketiga Faculty Development. Beliau melayani di bidang pendidikan sejak 2001 dan terus-menerus melayani di bidang ini dengan fokus kepada formation theories and practices that transform lives and communities. Dan saya tidak sendiri, saya bersama dengan rekan-rekan saya. Yang pertama, Ibu Pendeta Yeseli. Beliau adalah pendeta di Gereja Kristen Indonesia Jemaat Kayu Putih. Dan saat ini beliau sedang studi di Luther Seminary, Minnesota. Kemudian sahabat saya, rekan diskusi saya, yaitu Genesaret Cecilia. Beliau adalah seorang mahasiswa di bidang matematika yang saat ini sedang studi di Jerman. Beliau akan menemani saya bersama Dr. Eric Kyle, akan berdiskusi satu tema menarik dari buku Dr. Eric Kyle. So, Dr. Eric Kyle, this is your time. You can share for us.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. So glad to be here with all of you. And I'm so grateful to our gracious host for inviting me to be a part of this. This is a wonderful opportunity to talk about a subject that I'm passionate about, which is understanding people and how we can work through our Christian education programs to partner with God and to respond to God as God guides us, as Christ guides us, to bring change to ourselves and to one another. And so we're going to be talking about this book that I wrote a few years ago. If we could share the slides. Great. Wonderful. Thank you. So the book is entitled Spiritual Being and Becoming. And what I'm going to do is just give a quick kind of overview of this book to give you a sense of what the project focused on. And as we go through, I'll be talking about how this can apply to our role as Christian educators in our churches. So we'll just dive right in here. So goals. What we're going to be doing here briefly in the next 30 minutes or so, and then I hope to have some rich discussions after that, is first kind of look at some of the different views of human nature from Western Christianity as well as Western scientific theories that are out there. And then we're working toward the goal of this book was really to work towards synthesizing a model of human nature, trying to understand this rich and beautiful complexity that we call human, that we call people, and trying to better understand how does God work with and through individuals to change them and to kind of help them grow and become more spiritual. And then we'll talk, as I said, throughout about some of the implications for Christian education. So this kind of a brief overview of the chapters of the book. Chapter 1 really focuses on 8 different models of human nature that come out of the Western Christian tradition. Chapter 2 then looks at 8 different theories or models coming out of Western science. And then chapter 3 tries to work towards synthesizing a model that we might use to help guide the work that we do in Christian education and in spiritual formation. And then chapter 4 was this very abstract chapter, probably the most abstract thing I've ever written. I tell people, I think I start the chapter off saying, you can skip this chapter, it's very abstract. But if you like that kind of stuff, you can look at it. And then chapter 5 is let's take this model that was applied in chapter 3 and a little bit of what was done in chapter 4 and apply it to an actual case example. So that's kind of an overview of this book. There's some limits to this, clearly, as I've tried to emphasize already. This focus on Western worldviews, so it's Western Christianity, Western Christian religious traditions. It's also Western scientific models, so it does not honor the rich traditions of Christianity or other religious traditions around the globe. It also doesn't draw from other ways of engaging with scientific methods and findings from other contexts around the globe. That is a very big limitation. Most of these authors are European or Euro-American, mostly male authors. That's a big limitation. So if you would read women authors or authors from other contexts or social locations, you would find very different perspectives. So those are some very real limitations to this work. This work moves towards abstraction and generalization as opposed to being very locally contextualized. So just we have to hold those in mind as we look at as we think about these models that are being considered. So let's dive right in. So we're just going to look very briefly at just 4 different of the models that I considered from the Western Christian tradition, and then we're going to try to synthesize across those models. Actually, we'll be synthesizing across all 8 that comes from the book. So let's just dive right in. So this first one comes from a book by Joel Green on looking at biblical views, particularly from the Hebrew Bible, and their views of human nature. And again, the goal is to try to better understand how human nature works and how God tries to work through human nature. And so basically you can see in this model is there's this emphasis really in the Hebrew view of soul is really meant to mean like whole self. It's holistic view of the person. It's one that's very physical and embodied. It's one that has something of the divine image or nature within it. But there's also sin and distortion that's an integral part of it. And we know that people have a relationship to God through that, but we also have a relationship to one another, as well as to our physical environment, to nature, to creation. And so as Christian educators, this gives us insights into the different ways that God is trying to work and shape the individual so that we can partner with God as God tries to transform people's lives. So we can work through people's relationships. We can work through people's physical environment. We can work with people's direct relationship with God. So that's kind of this biblical view. And this notion of soul is different than what we find later on in Christianity, which is kind of comes out of Greco-Roman views of a soul, which is kind of this distinct part of a person, which we're going to see here next. In the Hebrew Bible version of the soul, it really refers to whole integrated self as opposed to just one part of a person. So that's where we kind of shifts us into, we fast forward a few hundred years to Maximus the Confessor and kind of his views of what the human person is and what shapes the human person. So he has this concept of a soul. It's more like a Greco-Roman concept of a soul a little bit, kind of separating body from mind from soul with these different parts. This is kind of a complicated model, but basically you can see in Maximus's model is that we have these complicated parts of ourselves. We have a rational part of ourselves. That's how we access God. We have this irascible part of ourselves that connects us with our relationship with others. And we have this concupiscible, I'm not even sure how to pronounce that, but that relates us, that's kind of connects us to nature, to our physical environment. We have these passions that comes from the fall in the Bible. And so those kind of distort us and kind of can lead us away from God. And so the goal of the mind is to try to help through rationality achieve a relationship with God and achieve our higher self. So as Christian educators, again, these become different avenues through which we can partner with God to help influence and shape people, again, through relationships with others, relationships with nature, through use of intellect and rationality to help people how we interact with the passions and our bodies. These are all become the basis for spiritual practices, for liturgies in our church, in our churches, in our communities. So this is helpful insights. But we're already seeing some themes that are common just in these first 2. So as we continue forward, let's look for other commonalities. Fast forward another few hundred years to Martin Luther. Luther had really kind of a more simplified view of a person. I'm sure if there's Lutheran scholars, you might challenge me on that. This was my understanding. I'm not a Lutheran scholar, but the simplified version of Luther's view of human nature is kind of there's this outer part of ourselves, kind of, thinking of Paul's letters talking about flesh versus spirit. Luther interprets that kind of as flesh, carnal, older person, he called it. But then there's this inner person, this spiritual person. That's where the soul abides, this newer person, where it's encased in distortions. And the goal is this relationship with Christ through faith. It's for us to move from the older outer person to this newer, inner, more spiritual person. And Christ is what Luther called the maxima persona, or the greatest person. Christ is the model for us, for this inner person. Christ is the one who wins the battle for us in this fight between outer person, inner person, between older self and newer self. So it kind of helps us to understand as Christian educators, perhaps gives us insights into some of the inner battles and struggles that people have, that we have, as we try to achieve this relationship with God. And so Lutheran spirituality then can be, very Christ-centered through faith and letting Christ do the work within us. And so as Christian educators, trying to help people to partner with Christ in that work to achieve this newer self. So moving right along, again, we're just getting little tastes of different views of human nature. I hope that you're already seeing this rich diversity of how people in Christianity have viewed individuals and viewed people in the relationship with God. But we're also seeing some themes, again, that are constant across these. So we just one more model that we'll consider here for our Western Christian thinkers. This, again, fast forward another few hundred years to Karl Rahner, who was a Roman Catholic theologian in the last century. And for Karl Rahner, what was some of the things that were central for Rahner was this notion of, yes, we have free will, but we're really emphasis on being historically rooted and shaped by events that have happened throughout history in our own lives. And a key to Rahner's thought, too, is this notion of what he called transcendentality, which kind of ties to Western contemplative traditions and this notion that there is a part of us which we can transcend ourselves. We can reach this place of unknowable essence, or this groundless ground within us. So if you've studied mysticism, this kind of leans in that direction of getting in touch with the transcendence of God and kind of connecting with the transcendence of God within ourselves. And that was what Rahner kind of held up as one of the ideals and things that we're trying to achieve, is trying to connect with this transcendent part of ourselves. That orients us toward God and through which God connects to us. And that's shaped, of course, by our community as well as the histories that we find ourselves within. So those are just 4 quick models out of the Western Christian tradition. And so one of the things that I try to do in my book is there were 8 models that I looked at. So there's 4 others in the book, but try to step back and say, well, what is common across these, or how might we be able to pull these different models together into a more unified model? And what are the basic elements that we as Christian educators can be aware of and work through to help shape people's lives? And so this is the model that I developed. We have this physical part of ourselves. We have the cognitive or intellectual or rational part of ourselves. We have emotional part or affective part of ourselves. There's something of the divine within us that's continually working, whether that's transcendent or in immanent ways. Yes, we are immersed in distortions, but yet we're also being continually drawn toward being integrated and whole. We're shaped by relationships to other people. We're shaped by our relationships with beings from other realms, things of angels, right? We're shaped by our context, by our environment, by the histories that we come from. And so as Christian educators, being aware of these different avenues through which God is working continuously, through which Christ is working to shape and transform people's lives. Our goal, for me, our call, is to partner with God as God works through all these different areas, the cognitive, the affective, through our relationships, through our relationship with, angels, through our relationship with the environment, and try to partner with God as God works to change people's lives, is what we're doing as Christian educators. So that's kind of an overview of the Western Christian models that were in this text. So we're going to then jump over to kind of Western modern science views and look at some of the models within Western modern science to help us understand some of the things that modern science is uncovering that gives us better insight into what shapes human nature. And again, we can theologize this as Christians to say these are avenues through which God works. So our first one is this kind of biological, really evolutionary, genetic view of human nature and what shapes human nature. So in the evolutionary genetic perspective, genes are being passed on from one generation to the next. And how those genes express themselves in the current generation will shape the biology of that person. So you can think of, and we're going to talk about neuroscience views next, but you can think, we inherit genes from our parents. Those genes express themselves depending on our environment and what's happening around us, that then shapes how our biology develops. So think of our brain and how our brain develops and how it forms as we grow older. And then how that brain develops is going to shape what we think, how we feel, how we act in the world. And so this evolutionary genetic is really focused on trying to understand theologically how God works through genetics being passed from one generation to the next to shape people's lives. Of course, as Christian educators, we can't really influence genes being passed from one generation to the next, but we can have an influence on, through our programs, on possibly, how genes are expressed in a person's life, because we know that genetic expression is influenced by people's environments. So if we're working socially, politically, and economically in our communities to help improve things, that will then impact how genes express themselves as people engage with their physical environments. And so this gives us some insights into just the complexity of human nature and the things that can shape and influence human nature. Some of those things are beyond our control, but I find it's still helpful to understand them. So the next one is neuroscience views. And if you haven't studied at least a basic or haven't yet had a basic understanding of neuroscience as a Christian educator, I would highly recommend that you at least have a basic understanding of how neuroscience, how the brain works, because it can give really key insights into how we work with people. And this is kind of a simplified view of the brain, is that they call it the tripart model is what it's called. There's kind of three parts of the human brain. There's this cerebellum and kind of the cerebellum and the brainstem, which is kind of stimulus response neural networks. So, if something scary happens, we might have a visceral response, an immediate response, kind of stimulus response part of the brain. There's the limbic system, which kind of has the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus. It's kind of the emotional part of the brain, influences the hormones that are released and the chemicals that kind of then influence how the rest of the brain fires and operates. And then you have the neocortex, which some people call the thinking part of the brain, which is kind of where, we think self-esteem or identity or critical thinking, how we process things happens in the neocortex. It's a very simplified view, not completely accurate of how the brain works. But the other thing to understand is that brain, when you say a brain, it's not just what's in our head, but it's really our whole body. So kind of going back to that Hebrew Bible view of the soul, brain really is our whole self. We know there are neural networks throughout our muscles. We know there's neural networks around the heart and our intestines that influence our thinking, that influence our decisions. So that intuition, that gut feeling, we call it in the West, those are actual neural networks in the intestines that kind of influence the decisions that we make. So when you think brain, don't just think head, think whole body, whole being, and that shapes us. So as Christian educators, I think it's really important to understand just the basics of neuroscience, and particularly how brain shapes and forms and develops across the lifespan, because that can give us really key insights into how we work with, say, young children. Their brains are developed in specific ways that are different from a teenager's brain, that are different from someone in middle age, that is different from someone who is toward the end of their lifespan. And so kind of understanding how that brain develops across the lifespan, I've found to have some really key insights, which helps me to better work with people in Christian education programs and the types of activities that we do and the types of spiritual practices that I lead people in is shaped by that. Because again, even though we're talking science, as a Christian, I theologize that. Like, God is working through these neurons and these neural networks. God is working through brain development. And so the better I can understand what God is trying to do within and through these, the more closely I can partner with the work that God is doing within this person's life. So that's a very simplistic overview of a very complicated field of neuroscience. But let's fast forward. The next one is psychodynamic motivational views. So I chose Freud for this. I'm not Sigmund Freud, who's kind of well known in modern Western psychology. I'm not a big fan of Freud myself, but he's so well known and his theories are so widespread that I just couldn't ignore this. I had to have this as a part of the model. But you can also think of like Carl Jung is another Western psychologist. You can think of phenomenological humanistic. It's one of the other models I look at. But anything that talks about the psyche and our motivations and the things that affect us more at an emotional, affective level. So in Freudian thought, there's kind of three parts to the psyche. This id, which is kind of shaped by our biological passions and movements. We have the super ego, which is really the ideals. You can kind of think of it as our conscience or the moral judge, that voice that's constantly telling us to do good and be better. And then in the middle of that, trapped in the middle of that, is ego, just trying to stay afloat, being pulled in one direction by id, but being, invited into another direction by super ego. And that those drives, ego is trying, which is our conscious brain, is trying to choose between the path toward life, the path toward death. Freud was Jewish, so you can kind of hear Psalm 1, choose whether you're going to choose the path of life or choose the path of death. And so ego, our conscious brain, our conscious mind, is trying to choose, what direction do I head in amidst all of these inner conflicts and struggles that we can have. So as a Christian educator, it kind of gives some insight into some of the different struggles that we have with anxiety or with motivation, with, directions our life should go. Should we choose to do good and help others, or should we choose, a life of maybe that's not so good and helping others? It's these struggles that we have. And so as Christian educators, understanding some of those inner dynamics, what happens within people's thoughts and their feelings, and what God is trying to do within and through those thoughts and feelings can be helpful for us, I think, as Christian educators. So the next one, the last one we'll be looking at for modern science is kind of social cognitive views. A lot of Western psychology for a while focused solely on thoughts and feelings and looking inside of a person, what we call intrapersonally, inside the person. But social cognitive has done some of that, where they're looking at kind of, cognition and how we think about things, our emotions, the motivations we have, the goals, self schemas, like in terms of what we think about ourselves as a good person or a Christian person or a not so good person or a rebel or whatever that might be. But the emphasis in kind of social cognitive models is on that social part, is on how situations and contexts shape what happens inside of us, how we learn from others. So if I grew up in a neighborhood where I see people, for instance, stealing regularly and they get away with it, I might be learning like, oh, maybe it's okay to steal because I can get away with it. Or if we see people steal and they get arrested on the spot, we would be learning from that, that maybe stealing's not so good because I could get in a lot of trouble, right? So some of the social cognitive theories kind of look at how our environment, the social cultural environments we live in, shape who we are as individuals and how they influence us. And so as Christian educators, it's understanding that as well, and being engaged as Christian educators in those social environments, that if we really want to transform people's lives, we can't just focus on individuals alone by themselves, but we also have to engage with the social and cultural environments, the neighborhoods, the communities, the workplaces that they're in, the political and economic environments that are around them, because that shapes how we think, how we behave, how we act, our relationship with God, our relationship with one another. And so I think that's important for us as Christian educators to kind of understand these models as well. So just as we did with our Western Christian models, where we try to synthesize across those Western Christian models, I did the same thing in this book, trying to synthesize across these Western science models. And so this is the model that I kind of developed, that we have some, which seems somewhat similar, you might notice, as the Western Christian model I synthesized. We have this physiological, this cognitive affective, super consciousness. I drew from some transpersonal researchers for that piece. But you can see we're shaped by our context, we're shaped by our environment, where there's moves and drives towards integration and harmony within ourselves as well as with others. We're historically rooted, genetically, culturally, socially, right? So these are some of the themes that came out. So looking across all of those models, so there were 16 models total, I synthesized this somewhat more complex model, which may or may not be helpful for you as a Christian educator. To try to simplify it, this is a lot on one slide, but to kind of simplify it, just focus on these three columns. So think intrapersonally, what's inside of a person. We have our physiology, our biological brain. We have our psychology, the thoughts and feelings. But then we have this part of ourselves that moves us toward our transcendent selves, going back to kind of Karl Rahner's thought and others in Western Christianity with that. And there's also modern scientists who are studying meditation and contemplation, who are also finding that transcendence, integration of the whole self is a part of what we can understand from Western science views. So that's kind of inside the person, intrapersonal. And you can think we're also, so as Christian educators, those are things that we can work with to try to help shape and help people to deepen their relationship with Christ in their lives. But we also think interpersonally, our relationship with others. Think of relationship to our physical environment around us. Think of relationship socially and culturally with other people. And also, too, there's this sense interpersonally of having this sense of oneness with one another. When we work together on a team, or when we're with a spouse or a significant other, or with a child or a family member that we love deeply, we can have this sense of oneness with them. And God works through that sense of connection and what attachment theorists call attunement, where we feel really attuned and at one with one another. So these are other ways interpersonally in our relationships we can have. And then there's this transpersonal influences as well. In Eastern traditions, they call that energy, chi or prana or ki. There's every time we pray for someone and we lay hands on somebody for healing, there's some, at least my experience of it, is there's some sense of energy that's being transferred from us as a community to that individual to try to help healing. That's kind of that energy level. You can think parapsychological, that's kind of a technical term, but really, again, think of us when we pray for somebody else in another part of the world. There's some belief that our mind through our prayer can have some influence, whether it's through angels, whether it's through Christ, whether it's directly on the environment, the situation there. That's kind of mind matter, they call that connection. But then there's also this sense of attunement that transcends people transcends community. We can have this sense of connection with all of creation through time and space and feel attuned to that all. So as Christian educators, these are areas that that kind of comes out of this book of us being able to work intrapersonally within people, working interpersonally in relationships and contexts, and kind of working transpersonally or transcending time, space, relationships to shape people and their lives. And so I do have a few more slides, but I think what I would like to do is kind of have us pause and engage in discussions. I've sent the slides in to our gracious hosts who can make those available to you, or you can, of course, email me directly and I can send those to you. But what I would love to do is have conversations after we hear from our guest panelists about, what are some of the implications of models like this for Christian education? Are they helpful for you? Do you find that they help you to work more effectively as Christian educators or in ministry? If so, why and how? If not, why not? What are some of the challenges and limits? So thank you so much for time and allowing me to speak about these things and share about these things.
Thank you, Dr. Kyle, for your presentation. It's very, it's a broad survey that you try to make concise in your presentations. It's very helpful for us. So I would ask my friends in our room if you have questions and response. Maybe I start with Lita Yesili, if you want to have a response, give it to you, and then Dr. Kyle can respond directly to Pastor Yesi.
Okay, Dr. Kyle, thank you for synthesizing this really complex material for us and to think about the connection between this stuff with the implication for Christian education. So I have one question probably because I see this that this spiritual connection in human from both the psychological, the Western Christian tradition, and also from the basic material of psychological and others are really essential. So my question is if this Christian education happen in the family to transform or to transfer their faith. I mean, for instance, like intergenerational faith transmission in the spiritual formation. So how to connect it with the things that you already share to us. I mean, because every people have like different aspect, like different ages have different social influence and everything. So how to practice it in the Christian education in transmitting faith within the family context. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pastor Yesi. What a wonderful question. Can we stop sharing the slides by chance?
Oops.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, no, great, there you are. Thank you, Pastor Yesi. Yeah, what a wonderful question. So I find these models kind of help give insight into how can, for instance, grandparents have an influence on their grandchildren. You can already see that from the social-cognitive theories, right? So grandparents become models for grandchildren and their behaviors and the things that they value. Social cognitive theorists would say that grandchildren are observing their grandparents and how they behave, what they value, how they spend their time, how they interact with other people. Those grandchildren are just like sponges. They're absorbing that. Those are becoming models for them, what they would call schemas for them, which are basically psychic models for them, that those grandchildren can then are more likely to follow suit and behave in similar ways, although they do have a choice to say, oh, I reject behaving like that, or I embrace behaving like that. So that's one way that can happen intergenerationally, or does happen intergenerationally within families. I think parents, grandparents, working across generations, and so, I mean, one way to hear that question is it helpful to teach families these theories to help them work, to transmit faith? Probably not the full complex model, but some of the basics of realizing that if you're going to work, for instance, with children, understanding that children have complex thoughts and feelings. They're being shaped by their peers, their schools, their friends that they have, things like that. And so being aware of that and being able to work with that, I think you see that with parents trying to decide what activities their children do, which it has an influence on which peers they hang out with, what schools they go to, if there's choice in that. You see parents doing that, which churches to attend. All of that are kind of decisions that parents and have an intergenerational effect on their children. I'd be curious on some of your thoughts and your work in your ministry on this as well, and kind of how would you answer that question?
Okay, Pastor Yesi, if you have feedback, you can directly answer.
Yeah, thank you. I just reading another book, Faith and Family, about how to transmit faith from the grandparents until to the children, and I find like this is like a seems a connection between what you have said and what I read, because when you say that example is really matters, uh, that's what I found. So for instance, like um, some young people left the church and becoming like a prodigal, or maybe the agnostic, because of there's a lack of example from their parents, and also yeah, there's like something lost within their self, but it's can sometimes it's kind of like a pullback, their yearning and their longing, but there is something missing also. Yeah, thank you for your explanation. I think that's one of the biggest things that we
Yeah, and I
really
would
need.
also recommend James Fowler has a book called Stages of Faith. It's a somewhat complicated book. You can actually find simpler explanations of the stages of faith online. But he talks about how it's what they found in that research, studying thousands of children growing up, is that when children hit late teenage, early young adult, it's common or normal for children to kind of break away from what their family routines and traditions have had, to kind of explore other ways of being and becoming. And that's just a part of normal identity development. Like children, we each have to find what's meaningful for us. And so we've seen our family and what they can do and how they do things and what they value, but we also need to explore other people, because in exploring how other communities, other families, other traditions have done things, that then helps us figure out who we are, because we've tried on our family, we've lived with our family, but now we're trying on other tradition, other communities, other ways of being, and we go, yeah, that kind of fits, but not really, and this one over here kind of fits, but not really. And it's through that kind of exploring different ways of doing and being that teenagers, young adults then find themselves, which is, again, one of the next stages in Fowler's stages, which we come to settle in our own identity, which is a combination and by our families, but also these other explorations. And so churches, in doing youth and young adult ministries, can help shepherd that and can help youth kind of explore other ways of being a person, of being a Christian, and kind of guide that, so that, it's kind of, you're kind of helping to shepherd them through those explorations and through those reflections, so that they're not just doing it on their own and, getting involved with who knows what, but kind of doing it as a part of the community. So yeah, that might be helpful as you think more about that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kyle and Pastor Yesi. So, Gine, you can you turn right now.
Yeah, Dr. Karl, I first want to thank you for the presentation. I find it a very interesting presentation, trying to expand the notion of human nature beyond what we typically think of when we talk about humans in the Western world, I think. I'm sure we'll get to Indonesian context in a moment because that's where most of our audience come from. But I want to first ask it from a Western context. I myself study in Germany, so I think this will also still be a very interesting one. Given that most of our education system, what I mainly take from your lecture, from your ideas, is that there is a dimension that we often forget when it comes to human nature, that there is the transpersonal, what Rahner said to be transcendental dimension, and the history of psychology, the history of secular development has been slowly moving towards that in a certain way. So you start with a Freudian model, but you then move to a more social model, which kind of emphasize more and more the need for an other, the need for something that is transcendent in a certain sense. So my question will be given towards that. Given that we are coming from a very modern form of education in a lot of countries, particularly in Asia, but I also think partially also still in the West, most of our schooling system are built on industry in system of industrial age. How do you see educators today, Christian, so people who are Christian but work in secular education, especially, for example, in the United States, to be able to break out of this form of education, which have a very huge emphasis on people as thinking machine and only as processing machine, and to be able to give space to this more wholeness that you talk about in your sense, this more whole sense of humanity that we talk about in the seminar, while still maintaining, and I know this is a very hot issue in the United States, maintaining the secular nature of the discussion, because U.S. institutions are by constitution banned from becoming religious, teaching religious. So I like to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Yeah, what a wonderful question. Yeah. So certainly, I think you see in like the Hebrew Bible model, we saw this concept of the whole self. That in my experience in a U.S. context, is there have been people who are trying to approach education more holistically than just pure intellectual, cognitive, rational. And educational research is finding that when we do that, it's more transformative for students, that the learning is deeper, meaning it's more transformative. It impacts students' lives more fully, more holistically, but also more sustainably. And I mean, one of the one of the sayings that we've had that kind of floats around in education is that the best education is being done in kindergarten classrooms. Because you can think of a kindergarten classroom as like, it's very holistic. Like children are playing, they're being creative, they're interacting with each other, they're doing art projects, they're doing science projects, they're running on the playground, right? You're engaging the whole child when you do that. Well, I mean, really, as adults, we should be playing on, maybe not playing on playgrounds, but we should be engaging as our whole self, not just, like you said, this industrial model. What Paulo Freire, who is a South American educational theorist, has a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, talks about the banking model of education, where it's like, I, as an instructor, am just am a bank, and I'm giving you knowledge. I'm transmitting knowledge to you, and your job as a student is to receive that knowledge and take it inside. Freire challenges that banking approach to education for a more holistic approach, one that's more engaged socially, politically, economically, more engaged in the whole lives of the students. So education, there is enough educational research now that documents that when we engage the whole student, it's more transformative for them over the long term. To get to the second part of your question that I heard, and I might be missing a part or two, so if so, let me know. But is how, so I'm no longer at the Lutheran School of Theology. I've now shifted. I now work at the University of Central Oklahoma, which is a secular state university. So I am not allowed to proselytize or evangelize or kind of talk explicitly about religion. So that your question is very relevant for me, is how do I, as a Christian, operate using these Western Christian models to guide education in secular classrooms. I work with faculty to teach them how to teach. So how do I do that? I certainly, as I tried to do, as I talked about a little bit about our Western science models, I continually for myself theologize the models and think about my students through a theological lens. Like, what is Christ trying to do with these students or with these faculty? But I may not say that to them openly because I'm at a secular institution. But for my own faith development, my own faith journey, that helps me to continually remind myself, this is a ministry, this is a calling that I have. But I can still share. So one of the things I tried to show in that book is there's a lot of similarities between the Western Christian model that I synthesized and the modern Western science model. There's a lot of similar, physiological, psychological, kind of even transcendent parts of those models. So I can talk about it in secular terms because it's really in both models, the theological or Western Christian model, as well as the Western science model. We're still kind of working with the same dynamics, the same phenomena, people's bodies, people's relationships, people's thoughts, people's feelings. How I think about that as a Christian is different than how maybe a secular non-religious person that I work with might think about it, but we're still working with thoughts and feelings. And so I'm just asking the question, what is God trying to do through these thoughts and feelings? Whereas they may not be. They may be asking like, okay, how can I work with the thoughts and feelings to help the student learn? So there's I don't know if that helps. Does that kind of help answer your question, or what are your thoughts?
Maybe if I could push you a bit further, what are the common languages in which you kind of see this communication? So initially, I was thinking a lot of research currently in education in the field of educational well-being, for example, Zelig-One research. If you may expand a bit more on that, how do you see secular languages that we use right now in education kind of coincides with the biblical language of education? Perhaps for our viewers who are educators themselves, could really bring this home to schools and an institution.
Yeah, great question. Thanks for clarifying that. So there's a few different parts of education that are doing this work. One is, and this is at the university I'm right now, is a really big emphasis on what's called transformative learning. So Jack Mesereau is an adult learning theory scholar who kind of helped develop this model of transformative learning, which really is, again, addressing the whole student. Some people in the transformative learning, and this is, so John Dirks is kind of tied to transformative learning, talks about the soul and trying to shape the soul of the student. And there's others who are working in that realm within secular contexts as well, talking about soul more in the kind of the Hebrew Bible approaches, like the whole student. You can think of Parker Palmer is another popular person in the United States who kind of speaks to addressing the whole student, or the soul of the student, or the soul of education. So transformative learning. There is some secular educators talking about the soul of education, or the soul of the student. Another avenue is contemplative or mindful approaches to education. A lot of those thinkers are coming out of kind of Eastern, particularly Buddhist approaches, and kind of applying those in education, secular educational settings. So Ellen Langer, who's out of Harvard, has a book called Mindful Learning, which is really talking about how do you engage the whole student in educational process through mindfulness practices, just being present. It's really a contemplative approach to education. So those are some of the different ways that I've seen colleagues, counterparts try to kind of, be inspired from, I think, their religious traditions and bring those into a secular context in a way that's, allowed or acceptable.
Thank you so much. I turn it to.
Okay, thank you, Gene, for your questions, and Dr. Kyle. Before we go to the live chat, I would make a response for your book. For me, I like your title, Spiritual Become and Becoming, right? It's like we live in pilgrimage towards something good, or in Christian language, becoming Christ likeness. It's like we go. This is our goal, and I like the title and how you try to make you mapping about the Christians, theologians is very broad, like Augustine's, Maximus Confessor, Thomas Aquinas, Luther, Karl Barth, and Karl Rahner. It's very helpful for me to learn to read your book. So it's readable for me. So for Indonesian people, it's readable because you help with appendix, right? It's helping. It's to make a summary about your chapter in your book. It's very helpful. So I suggest to Indonesian people to read your book because it's readable. So I'm very thankful for your book. It's make me to know that theologians in the Westerns like Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, Maximus Confessor, because it's hard to read their books, especially Karl Barth and Karl Rahner, and you try to summary. It's very helpful for me, and I really agree with you that we need to understanding about what is human is, so to make approach, so we can approach the model of spiritual formation for every context and culture, because a human is complex, so we can make a same in so we can be a universe model for every culture. So we can approach every model that you try to synthesize, what kind of model it's matched with every particular culture. So I remember that some one of Eastern traditions that they try to make metaphor about spiritual formation, like a garden, like you said in the kind of garden. So we can nurture the garden and we can play together. So it's for me, like you said in the kind of garden. So because every person have different model, different body and different structure, so we can approach them with one model. So I think the model, like you said in kindergarten, is very uh, imagine imagine me. That's, yeah, we can play together, right, and learn together. Thank you very much for your book, Dr. Kyle. It's very helpful for me. So we move to um, live chats. So there's a questions. Thank you, Dr. Kyle. My questions: how you can suggest to Indonesian people to draw your idea to church and Christian educations? Because maybe, yeah, maybe you can add, yeah, because Indonesian have a different culture and there's a different approach. Maybe why you suggest to Indonesian people? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Of course, obviously I have to acknowledge I'm a product of Western culture. I grew up in the United States, so I'm not familiar with the Indonesian context or culture really with enough detail to be able to answer that question. So I would love to hear from our other two panelists or from yourself, Lafrendi, how you might respond to that. I can just say, as a general thing, just my own. I'm kind of a model builder, as you can tell. I like taking other people's theories and then synthesizing them together into something sometimes simpler, sometimes more complex. But what I would say in applying the model, so like in this one, you can see that final version of a model that I had is fairly complex. And what I would say is view that as like a skeletal framework, as like a starting point. And what my own experience of adapting general models to very specific context is that you start with this general abstract model, knowing that not all of it is going to apply to a local cultural context. So there may be parts of it that are more relevant to your own cultural context than another part. So focus on those parts of the model that are helpful, and set aside those that are not. You'll notice that so think of like people's thoughts and feelings. Well, okay, we might be able to say like, okay, most people around the world have thoughts and feelings, but what those specific thoughts and feelings in Indonesia are going to be different than they are in Germany, are going to be different than they are in Minnesota or Oklahoma or in Brazil, right? And so that's what you have to do as a Christian educator, is understand, okay, well, if thoughts or feelings are one of the ways that God works and shapes people, what are the specific thoughts and feelings that this specific church that I'm working with, or group of youth or older adults, are having right now, and what is God trying to do within and through those? So that's just some general thoughts. But yeah, I would love to hear from our panelists on that as well.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kyle. So, we want our. So this is the end of our discussion. So before we end, I would give to Dr. Kyle to make a statement to remind us about Christian education and spiritual formations, so we can rethink our practice in the church and family and Christian education. Thank you.
Yeah, well, again, thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you so much to our panelists and your questions and your responses and thoughts. I've been really enriched by our conversations. And I would just close by saying, really, the purpose of this book, when I did it, was to try to help me as a Christian educator better understand the people that I was in ministry with at the time, and even today. We're very complex as humans. We're very complex people. So the more as Christian educators we can understand those complexities, the better we're able to partner with what Christ is trying to do within and through people's lives. All of those things on that final model I synthesize, my own theology says that God is already present, working within and through every single part of the person. Every atom, every molecule, every cell, every thought, every feeling, every relationship, like Christ is already there working. And so our job as Christian educators is to try to discern in community, what is Christ doing with this group of people, with this individual? What directions is Christ trying to have them go next in their lives? And understanding how people work and how the things that influence us and shape us, helps us to more closely partner with the work of God in their lives. You can think of it like a dance. Like two people want to dance together. I'm not sure what dances are popular in Indonesia, but you can think of, like in the West, like salsa dancing or line dancing or something like that. But if we know the steps ahead of time, we can move together in harmony, right? If we can discern what God is trying to do with this youth group or with this adult Bible study, we can partner more closely with God when we know the dance steps. And so that's kind of the purpose of these models, is try to better help us understand what are some of the different steps, some of the different ways and means that God works in people's lives, so that we as Christian educators can work more in harmony with that. And so my prayers and blessings to each one of you in all of your ministries. And again, thank you for our time.
Thank you, Dr. Kyle, for your time to share your idea, your thoughts in your book. So, terima kasih pemirsa Belajar Teologi buat waktu dan kesediaan kalian. Jumpa lagi kita di episode yang akan datang. Saya Lefrandi beserta dengan rekan saya Pendeta Yesili dan Genesaret Sila pamit undur diri. Tuhan Yesus memberkati, and God bless you.